Hello and welcome to the Farnsworth Art Museum's lecture series. My name is Jude Valentine and I'm the coordinator of studio and public programs here at the Farnsworth. And before we get started, I wanted to mention that we'll be taking questions at the end of the program. And so as questions pop into your head, please put them in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A in the lower right-hand side of your Zoom screen. Today, I'm pleased to present a talk by Sarah Fisher, who was head of the Painting Conservation Program at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. for many years prior to retiring to Maine. Sarah Fisher's conservation career spanned 45 years. She has an undergraduate degree in art history and minored in studio art, starting her training in conservation in Italy, working on flood damaged paintings in Florence in 1967. She continued a self-designed apprenticeship education in Europe, studying in conservation programs in Stuttgart, Zurich, Amsterdam, and Brussels before returning to jobs in the United States in the Intermuseum Laboratory in Oberlin, Ohio, and at the Balboa Art Conservation Center in San Diego, prior to being hired by the National Gallery in 1981. There, she was initially senior conservator in paintings before becoming head of the department about 10 years later. She retired to Damariscotta with her husband in 2013 or 2012, following years of visiting family in the area. She's taken up her own painting since then, creating new art rather than taking care of old art, the great icons of our culture. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being part of our lecture series, and I'm so looking forward to your program.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jude, and I will get going because I have a lot of material that I'm trying to cover, and I hope I don't confuse you all by speaking about it too quickly. As Jude has said, I had a 45-year career at the National Gallery, a 45-year career in conservation, the last 32 years of which were at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Here I have a slide up, a great overview of the gallery on the Mall, the old 1940s building in the lower half of the painting, moving towards the I.M. Pei modern building, that H-shaped building in the to the upper left of it. And then it's a great location with a Capitol at the end. And on the right is what is probably was our most well-known painting, Leonardo da Vinci's early portrait of Ginevra da Benci. This painting is a little bit earlier than the Mona Lisa, which everybody knows very well. That's a little more, it's very delicately painted. And probably has a little less atmospheric effects, which was typical of his later painting. And this one is just an exquisite little portrait. Here is an image of our conservation department. It's a very large conservation department for a museum. This is painting conservation only. You can see light is really critical in a painting department, and well, both artificial and daylight was essential for us. We have very large easels to carry the heavy paintings on, big sturdy tables, and floor microscopes, floor stand microscopes that reach out over the paintings so we could study the middle of paintings as well as the outer edges. So this was a very well equipped department. We were quite large. I had a staff of 8 members, and with the interns and fellows, usually there were about 12 people in the department at the time that I was there. I plan to take you through step-by-step conservation treatments using as illustrations paintings from the gallery that we worked on while I was there. Then if I have time, I'll add a few tales of my adventures as a career, accompanying the great masters as they traveled around on international exhibitions. First, I need to explain to you, what does a painting conservator do? the conservation field divides up the artwork under its care based on the material of which the art is made. Not everybody realizes that. Painting conservators deal only with two-dimensional painted works on canvas or solid support, like wood or metal or whatever. Paper conservation is a completely separate field. That's anything, any work of art on paper. Then there are all sorts of other fields: objects conservation, textile conservation. There's even a waterlogged wood conservation field, modern media conservation. Each requires an understanding of very different materials, so conservators tend to specialize in those areas. My training, as you have heard, was in Europe through an apprenticeship system, and I was trained as a traditional painting conservator. At the time, I could work on anything from an Egyptian Fayum portraits, that was probably the earliest painting we had at the National Gallery, to huge modern paintings. But in most of my career, I focused on pre-20th century paintings. I was more of an old master conservator. We had a staff member, Jay, who was a specialist in modern contemporary painting conservation. Here's Jay working away on one of our many large Rothkos. Jay eventually became the head of the department after my retirement. Now note that I've been retired for 8 years and I've totally left the conservation field, as Jude said. I don't do any private conservation work and I have delighted in focusing on my own art. This is where you can find me in the summertime painting away down at our local lighthouse, the Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. And I just want to sort of remind you that I have been retired for 8 years. So the policies and procedures I'm talking about at the gallery were what were common back when I was there, and things could have changed since then. I'm not sure. So what does a conservator, a painting conservator, actually do? A museum-based painting conservator's main focus is quite broad. It is to preserve and conserve the museum's painting collection by both treating the individual paintings as needed, but also by working with the rest of the museum staff so that such practical treatments rarely have to be done. The goal is to ensure that the museum's environmental conditions, handling standards, all of that all meet certain levels, required levels. However, because of the gallery's size, large staff, and the long presence of a strong conservation department there, other gallery staff were responsible for some of the things I've mentioned, such as the gallery's environmental controls. There was building maintenance staff. Registrar's office took care of shipment. The education department took care of other things. So we could actually spend most of our time in painting conservation on carrying out the practical treatments as needed. What is involved with this, you may ask? Well, first, you need to be aware that conservators see paintings as a complex of layers, with each layer requiring different kinds of attention and each interacting with the other and the whole in different ways. Here's a little sketch of a cross-section through a painting, if you can understand it. The lower level is the support layer. In this case, it's a wooden panel, and then different levels going on up. We've got the support layer, the ground layer, which is often called the gesso layer, the underdrawing or sketch layers, the paint layers, and finally the varnish on top. Each has its own problems. In a museum such as the gallery, paintings were put on a priority list for conservation treatment for various reasons, but not usually because we had severe problems like big holes, tears, split panels, flaking paint, sagging canvas. We didn't have to face that. Those are the problems that often a private conservator has to deal with, because often private owners are not able to maintain the same stable environmental conditions that museums are able to do. Also, because we had had a strong conservation tradition at the gallery since the 1940s, the paintings were really in basically good structural shape, and we rarely had to deal with these problems. So how did we prioritize our treatments? They were mainly for aesthetic reasons, and also research reasons. Did the painting convey the message that the artist wanted? Was the appearance close to the artist's original intent? were there aspects in the painting that distracted from the overall message? That's what we were trying to deal with. I should maybe interrupt here briefly to tell you about the values of the works we were dealing with. For those of you who haven't thought much about this question, you might wonder why in heaven's name are museums spending so much time and trouble with these works? Why do conservators spend so much time? Why does the museum invest huge amounts in supporting a big conservation department, which is a very expensive proceeding? Well, if you think about it a bit, the paintings are icons of our cultural heritage. That's why museums exist in the first place. And besides this abstract value to humankind, their financial value from a practical point of view is very high. I looked up the auction price of the Leonardo da Vinci portrait of Christ that recently was sold, and I think it was 2017 in New York, and it's sold for $450 million. The estimated value, I looked it up too, of the Mona Lisa at the time it was about $834 million. Here she is, smiling enigmatically at you. I suspect our little portrait of Ginevra da Benci would fall the price for her if she were to go up on the market now would fall somewhere in between that. So a museum's responsibility is very large just from the financial viewpoint, and conservators bear a huge burden in their share of that responsibility. So the job can be somewhat stressful because of that. But back to the steps in treating a painting. Once it was decided that it might be a priority for treatment, a painting was then brought off the wall in the gallery to the studio, and it would undergo a thorough examination. Here is one of my staff members, Elizabeth, looking closely at a northern panel painting with a microscope. After that, a treatment report and treatment proposal would be written explaining the painting's condition and the reasons for treatment. A technical investigation in our studio would be carried out if the painting demanded it. In other words, if it was for various reasons a very important painting, if there were major treatments needed, then a thorough technical examination would be carried out to warn the conservators what they might have in front of them. It first involved examining the painting with a high-powered microscope, as you see here, then possibly using X-radiographs, infrared light to understand the painting's structure, to assess the number of damages hidden by the old restoration, possibly, and to learn more about the artist's technique. X-radiography penetrates through all the paint and the ground and the support layers. It can reveal old damages, artists' underlying changes in the design, which are not visible on the surface, and the structure of the support layers. It can show you a lot about the painting. Here is on the left an old slide, an old image of Doug, our technician, getting ready to make an X-ray of a painting on the movable easel with the old X-ray equipment. Doug recently sent me updated composite of some of the newer X-radiography equipment that isn't used nowadays, with all is done digitally, and the X-ray plate is quite different from the old X-ray film that we used to have to develop by hand. Here is an example of an X-ray. This is a wonderful large painting by Watteau, important French painter from the early 18th century. On the left is the painting after conservation treatment, and on the right is the X-ray of the painting. Just to explain that white outline you see around the edge of the painting and the cross and bar in the middle, that is the wooden stretcher, which the painting's canvas has been stretched over, and the little tiny tacks around the edge of the oval you can see in the X-ray are what holds it in position, holds the canvas stretched over the stretcher. But what's interesting for us in this case is that odd upside down black triangle in the upper right center of the painting. It looks as if, I don't know what happened here, but it looks as if at some time in its history, the painting must have fallen off the wall against maybe the corner of a table or the edge of a chair, something very sharp, and a big triangular piece was torn out of it and then put back in at some time in a restoration treatment. when you look at the painting, though, on the left, you have no inkling of that. So this shows you how helpful X-rays can be in revealing this kind of damage. They also, it's kind of, people read about how they can show totally different painting under the painting you're looking at. They can show artist changes. They're quite a lot of fun, what you can find with an X-ray. Back to our lovely little Leonardo portrait of Ginevra da Benci. On the right is an infrared shot of the Ginevra. Not only does it show superficial damages, but it's more, you could say it's more superficial than the X-ray. It does not penetrate through all the paint and support layers. In this case, it shows the artist's underdrawing, which is the fine black line that the artist used to sketch the planned portrait out on his support before applying the paint layer. But what was fascinating for the conservators in this case is they discovered that Leonardo used what's called a pouncing technique to transfer his sketch from the initial paper that he probably drew it on to the final support. He pricked all the lines of his sketch with tiny little pin and then dusted charcoal. So he laid the paper, the pricked paper, down on the gesso covered final wooden support that he was going to paint on, laid the paper down, dusted charcoal through the little holes, and by that means he transferred the sketch to the final support. And it's hard to see in this image, but there are tiny dotted outlines surrounding her eyes, her eyelids, her eyebrows, her nostrils, her mouth, around the outlines of her head. It was quite wonderful to learn something about Leonardo's technique through the use of infrared photography. I should just mention as an aside, interesting with the Ginevra, is that the conservators also discovered fingerprints in the paint of the juniper bush behind Ginevra's head. That looks as if Leonardo tamped the paint down with his fingers, probably to create softer transitions. And we had the conservators had the FBI fingerprint analysis lab in to see if they could get a complete fingerprint from this little textured area, but they couldn't get a complete enough fingerprint to be able to say this is Leonardo's fingerprint. Just to, in addition, besides the conservators doing some of the basic investigation, the National Gallery's Conservation Science Department is world renowned for the work that it does. It's probably one of the best, if not the best in the country. In the upper, this is a composite of some of the analytical equipment they use. At the upper left is the digital, multispectral imaging department, where various kinds of multispectral rays are used to look at paintings. Then most of the other departments involve looking at tiny, tiny samples taken from the paintings, either pigments, varnishes, cross sections through the whole paint and varnish layer. It's again like an FBI lab looking at a crime scene by taking tiny little samples. These samples are analyzed and help the conservators a great deal in knowing what the paintings are made of, or what the conservation materials are that they're using. And at the same time, the scientists are doing their own research project as well. Back to the steps in treating a painting. Let's see, where was I? Yes. Finally, getting back to the examination and the report writing, once they were all finished and the approvals for the treatment proposal would come through from various curatorial levels and the administrative levels, the treatment could begin. A treatment could take from a day or two to a few years, depending on what the problems were. I should mention here also the thoroughness of the documentation of these treatments. Not only was this thorough examination done at the beginning, but a complete photographic record was kept all during treatments, before, during, and after the treatment, and a report after treatment was written, so anybody could come and know what had been done to the painting by looking at the files. So that was all on the record. The first step in a treatment was usually seeing to the structural well-being of the work. Although we had many paintings on wooden panels, which are usually the earlier paintings, many early paintings are on wooden panels. Typically, they rarely required any treatment, as they had very thorough, rather often heavy-handed carpentry-like work carried out on them before our time in earlier centuries. Now, I'm going to show you two examples of this kind of structural restoration work that we would no longer do today. And but it's interesting to bring up the concept for you of invasive restoration. It was very common in historical times. Earlier restorers didn't have the respect for the original always, that in all parts of the original, not just the surface of the painting, but the back, the whole material of the painting. We now try in our treatments to change the original material as little as possible. The less we do to a painting, the better. Here is an image of a 15th century Italian panel. From the corner, you're looking on the right at the back of the panel, and the front is the painted, on the left is the front of the painted surface of the panel. But I just wanted to show you a close-up of the kind of damage that could happen to these thick Italian panels. They were usually in the center of Italy, in the southern part of Italy. They were poplar wood, and they could easily be attacked by wood-eating insects in the damp old churches that they were hanging in. Now, this is a rare example of a 15th century painting that has not had any conservation work done to the back. Our great Raphael Alba Madonna is it's just an exquisite painting, but it has undergone an unusual treatment called a transfer. It was owned by the Russians in Catherine the Great's day back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it underwent what was a very much beloved treatment in those days, transferring the painting off of its wooden panel onto a canvas to avoid insect damage or get rid of the insect damaged panels that was the original panel of the painting, and to make it more easily movable and less susceptible to damage. So I won't go into the details of the treatment, but basically the original wood support was chiseled away from the back of the painting, and a canvas was glued right to the back of the paint and ground layer instead. It makes the painting is a beautiful painting now, but if you look closely at the surface, it has a hybrid quality. It has looks both like a painting on canvas. It has the texture of the canvas, but it also has characteristics of a wooden panel. It's original wooden panel with crackle and little splits and things that would be typical of wooden panel. Another type of rather invasive treatment that was done, this is more in the mid-20th, early 20th century, was called a cradle. On the left is our beautiful Giotto, the Madonna and Child. And on the right is the structure that has been adhered to the back of the painting. Giotto is one of the great masters, probably the greatest master of the early Italian Renaissance. The cradle, the idea of the cradle was to provide a support structure for a weakened painting that had possibly undergone that worm damage that I showed you first. The original wood would be chiseled away maybe to within a half an inch or so of the paint layer. Then sometimes a thin board would be glued to the back, but usually this cradle structure would be glued directly to the back of the original wood that was left. And the idea was that the vertical fixed members of the cradle would give the support, and the horizontal members are movable. They move in little slots within the fixed vertical members, and that would allow the painting still to expand and contract across the grain, but still give the painting firm support. It didn't always work too well. The painting still could split sometimes if it were faced with extreme changes in relative humidities. Could split along the edge of the fixed members there. So this is not, again, a recommended treatment, but because our environmental conditions were so stable, are so stable at the gallery, we didn't have to remove these cradles. So many of the early Italian paintings in the collection have this on their backs. Now the next, I'll move from these treatments of wooden panels. I should mention too that nowadays wooden panel problems are treated much more delicately. Every effort is made not to damage original wood, and if there are old restorations that have to be removed from the back of panels, very delicate carpentry work is carried out that is technically much more sensitive to the needs of the painting, and hopefully are not as invasive to the original material as the old techniques were. Now dealing with paintings on fabric, which that term covers sort of linen for the older paintings and cotton often for modern paintings. We also carried out we rarely carried out major structural work for the same reason. We didn't want it to be too invasive. But the most common conservation technique employed for at least 2 centuries to support old canvases that are fragile and had holes or tears was a process called lining or relining. Here's a very darkened painting that I worked on towards the end of my time at the gallery. Benozzo Gozzoli is a Tuscan painter from the beginning of the High Renaissance. A strange painting of Lazarus coming out of the cave there, Christ raising Lazarus. The aligning or relining, as it is called, if it's a second lining or third lining, involves the adhesion of a good quality fabric, either linen or synthetic fabric, to the back of the old canvas to reinforce it. Although we rarely needed to carry out this procedure at the gallery, and we again thought it was a little too invasive for a painting if the painting had never been lined before. By chance, I did decide to reline this early Italian painting. It had several old relinings on the back of it that were coming loose, and the glue paste that was holding them in place seemed to have white lead to strengthen it. It was very lumpy. The surface of the painting was very lumpy. So here is the Benozzo Gozzoli after the lining that I did. I removed 2 of the 3 old canvases that were on the back, and adhered the original painting that still had 1 canvas, later canvas on the back, to a new linen canvas with a non-penetrating adhesive. Critical in this lining procedure is what adhesive should be used and how much pressure to use to hold the new and the old fabrics together. If it's not correctly carried out, a lining could lead to severe changes in the original, such as discoloration of the paint due to the adhesive penetrating through into the original paint, or rather extreme changes in the painting's original surface texture. Almost all of our National Gallery paintings, our old masters, had been lined, and that's true with almost any museum in the United States. Some very good linings, very well carried out, and some not so well. We treasured those that hadn't been lined because they preserved their original freshness intact. Oh, and here's the Benozzo Gozzoli after treatment. It still has an odd pinkish look to the paint surface. I think it's because it was an unusual painting and that it was tempera on canvas, unusual in that era. And I think some of the old linings, the adhesives from the old linings must have penetrated through to discolor the painting that way. But here is a grand painting that has never been lined. It's very rare to have a painting of this era not lined. And although the original fabric is very fragile, and we tried not to lend this painting very often, so any vibration from transport wouldn't affect the fragile original canvas. It's wonderful to see this painting because the impasto, the brush strokes, are still very crisp and fresh, and there's no foreign texture imposed into the paint surface. We try nowadays to leave the original canvas in as pristine condition as possible. Tears can be flattened locally rather than gluing a hole, lining a canvas to the back of the painting. We can try to work locally, flattening the tears, lining up the original threads on each side of the tear, and dotting a little bit of adhesive in between the two sides of the threads so that they meet. Sometimes tiny bridges of Japanese tissue are applied behind the tear, taking the place of large old patches, which used to be used behind tears, but eventually their texture works their way through through to the front of the painting. Those are the more minimalist treatments we try to use, but sometimes a lining is necessary, and that's completely understandable. Now, moving from the structural treatment of the support layers, which I've talked about, I'll talk about structural treatment of the ground and the paint layers. But just briefly, I'll mention flaking paint, because again, at the gallery, we rarely had to deal with flaking paint, which is caused usually by changes in the relative humidity around the painting. This is a lower left corner of a Renoir, and you can see how dangerous these flakes are. If for some reason the paint isn't adhering well to the canvas and the ground, the flakes can drop off and large areas of beautiful original paint can be lost. This happens not to be a National Gallery painting, by the way. I just had a very good slide of this flaking paint, so I decided to use it. Flaking paint and ground layers are an inherent and unceasing problem for paintings in uncontrolled environments. Even in modern times, some artists might use poor techniques, and that could lead to flaking paint. A beloved painting such as our local favorite, Andrew Wyeth, had some trouble with his tempera paintings. For some reason, some technical reason, they have a tendency to flake. This is a beautiful, large tempera painting on board belonging to the National Gallery's collection, and it did have ongoing problems with little fine flakes falling off, especially in the lower part of the painting. Again, we tried not to lend a painting like this so that it couldn't be subjected to the vibration from transport that might come from exhibitions. To re-adhere flaking paint, depending on the paint medium and the support, we could use fine heated spatulas to warm up the adhesive and apply it locally to the flakes and gently push them down. If this was correctly done, the treatment wouldn't change the appearance of the paint and its texture, and the adhesives would have to be, of course, as compatible as possible with the original materials. This, I think, was an early Rothko, and this conservator is actually using a little hot air gun that heats up the adhesive that's been brushed on the painting, and then the flakes are pushed down individually. You can see why treatments can take very long with this sort of detail work. Now I'll move on to what I call the aesthetic aspects of conservation. This involves the removal of discolored or disfiguring varnish and any old discolored retouchings from the paint surface. The goal is to bring the painting back to a semblance of what might have been the artist's original intent. As you can imagine, the concept of original intent is much debated. Nobody can really agree on what was an artist's original intent. But what we want is to have the painting be understood as, as a balance between what the artist, how it looked leaving the artist's studio, and the degree of aging that normally would have taken place since it left the artist's studio. Varnishes, this is a great example of a painting during treatment. You can see what a dark, dirty varnish has been removed up to the left side, and it reveals a lovely, delicate details of this wonderful Dutch early 17th century painting, and you can see how the varnish really detracts from appreciating the painting. Varnishes were implied to almost all paintings up until the late 19th century to saturate the colors and to protect the surface from dirt and dust. And varnishing is still very important and common for artists today. Modern and contemporary artists may or may not use varnish depending on how important the surface qualities of their works are, but varnishes do play a vital and protective role for paintings. But as you can see here, these early natural resin varnishes, such as Damar, Mastic, Copal, they darken very quickly with age. Artists were aware of this and didn't want it to happen. But it wasn't really till the beginning with the Impressionists that artists began to stop using varnishes because of this worry. Here's this Renoir. It had the image on the left shows the partially clean painting, and it didn't have the varnish on it had not darkened anywhere nearly as much as on the Verbeek I just showed you. But still, even a moderately discolored varnish can affect the delicacy and the bright colors of a impressionist in many paintings. As you can see on the right, it's such a beautiful sparkly painting once the varnish has been removed. It really wasn't until the earliest 20th century that alternative synthetic resin varnishes began to be developed. Many are very stable and removable if needed and are highly recommended. It's always been challenging for conservators to find the ideal modern varnish to apply to their conserved paintings. The National Gallery's Conservation Science Department was instrumental over the years in developing new varnishes for conservators to use for their to apply to the great masters that they were working on. Now, about cleaning the varnishes off of paintings, solvents of various strengths have traditionally been used to remove yellowed varnishes, usually by dipping little cotton swabs in solvents to work square inch by square inch. Here is Kristen, who was then our fellow, removing the yellowed varnish from a Wyeth, an early French 19th century painter. You can see how much the yellow varnish changed the delicacy of the pink skin tones and the white drapery of her dress. Here is another one of my staff members, Anne, working on Monet's Grand Old Musician. And I should emphasize that any cleaning that was done is the result of thorough testing of different areas of the painting first to see which pigments, which paint areas in the painting might be sensitive to the solvents being used. Certain paints like lead white are relatively easy to clean, whereas the dark browns in the painting can be very sensitive to solvents. In recent years, other cleaning systems involving the use of specially formulated like enzymes, gels, and soaps have added to the conservator's cleaning toolkit and have helped very much avoid some of the problems of solvents. But just to describe it critical in the use of solvents is the difference between the solubility of the paint layer and that of the overlying varnish. Varnish is usually much more soluble than pigments present of the paint layer. As I've said, the more recent a painting is, it can be that it has had less time to dry, and the more sensitive it can be to solvents. When you hear somebody say that painting has a over-cleaned look, that means the speaker thinks that some original paint has been removed in the process of varnish removal. I mentioned previously how controversial some treatments could be. In 1978, the NGA had a large controversy involving the cleaning of this wonderful Rembrandt, the old mill from 1645 to 8. Here's a quick comparison of the two. You can see how before treatment, the painting was extremely dark, but it was an icon of sort of romantic writing at the time. And art historians interpreted it as a sort of an expression of Rembrandt's depressed state in those days when he was beginning to have financial problems. Then following cleaning, this is the way the painting looked. Now, which do you prefer? Because there was a huge controversy. The cleaning changed the appearance of the painting so much, even the director of the museum was shocked. Other conservators from outside the museum complained about it, and it took an international commission to examine what was done during the treatment and to read see the photography and finally exonerate the poor conservators who had worked on the painting, to tell them that they had done an excellent job. But the lessons learned from this, this controversy is simply that cleaning is not just a scientific process, nor is the in-painting following cleaning. It can be very subjective, the amount of varnish and old overpaint that's removed and the degree of in-painting following it depends very much on the conservator's experience and judgment, and really ends up being pretty subjective. Now, moving on quickly to the removal of old discolored retouchings. Here's a little Italian panel. And you can see that's rather discolored splotches in the pink architecture along in the left half, down to the discolored splotches along the bottom of the painting. These were once perfectly well-matching retouchings in missing areas, but they've discolored over time. Here is another example of this is a very large painting. So in this small image, you can't see the discolored retouching very well, but this is the painting before restoration. And it was very yellow and had extensive discolored retouching. Here is an example here is the painting after removal of all the retouchings and varnish. Here's a close-up of it, and on the right is the painting after treatment. Conservators only remove previous restorations if they, as I've said, make the painting difficult to understand and appreciate. And if they don't match the original, and if the conservator thinks that he or she can do a better job in replacing the missing areas than the previous restorer could. Here's the Girolamo after treatment. Next stage, I'll move on quickly, is the in-painting stage. Almost the final stage of the conservation process. It's called retouching. It's carried out with tiny brushes and can range from touching in tiny scratches and flake glosses. This is Elizabeth working on tiny flake glosses on an early Delacroix. But required first in the whole process is that any deep losses or depressions in the surface first have to be filled with a filling material before the in-painting can be put on top, so the in-painting stays very thin and won't discolor. Here I am working away on this little Chardin still life, and you see that there not only was there a strange loss in the upper edge I showed you before, but there were losses along the bottom edge. I think the painting had once been stretched over a smaller stretcher and had been made much smaller, and now in the present condition it had been flattened out, and there were big discolored missing areas along both edges. The paint used for in-painting must be stable and easily removable, so if the work is deemed incorrect 50 or 100 years from now, the in-painting can be removed without damaging the original. Here is a typical in-painting setup. Usually watercolor or stable synthetic resins are used for it. No original design area is covered as best as is possible. In previous centuries, artists were usually the ones who did the retouching of paintings, and they had no compunctions about covering over large original areas of paint around the losses to blend their retouching in better with the painting. So here's just a close-up of the Chardin that I did. I'll move along quickly. The final step in conservation treatment of our paintings is often varnishing. This is Carol putting a spray varnish on a British painting. As you have learned, this is not simple. Are you sure the artist varnished the painting originally? What did the artist want? Should the varnish surface be matte, glossy, dull, or saturated? What is the most stable and easily soluble varnish that will give you the right look, but could be easily removed 50 to 100 years from now if the future conservators deem that the work wasn't done properly? this gives you a very brief introduction to what's involved in practical painting conservation. I've just touched on a complex process, but I'll move now quickly to some more adventurous aspects of my job and give you a few stories about my travels with paintings. I realize I don't have too much time. I think I'll skip over some of the stories, but you may not have thought much about how the paintings you enjoy and wonderful exhibitions organized by museums have gotten to that spot. How do fragile works get safely shipped around the world? Well, there are very tight rules and regulations about packing and shipping of works of art, carefully negotiated in contracts between the borrowing and lending museums. Usually, if a painting is over a certain value, a courier was always required by the insurance company or the national indemnity to travel with the painting. The courier usually would first examine the painting closely prior to packing in the lending museum, then would watch the packing, then assisted by an agent at both ends of the trip, would travel with the work on truck or plane or whatever to the borrowing institution, be met by the agents there, and watch the handling of the painting till it and the unpacking till it got on the wall. Also carefully examining the painting on arrival to make sure there had occurred no damage in the whole process. I think I'll skip over for the moment. Maybe we can bring it up in questions. My travels to Russia and the Hermitage. This is a Hollywood picture of the Hermitage, but probably one of the most elaborate group of combined courier trips involving exhibition travel was the exhibition held at the National Gallery called the Treasure Houses of Great Britain, which was in Washington around in the mid 1980s, 85 to 86. Works of art from the great country houses of Britain were transported to the gallery to hang in the exhibition there. Sometimes whole rooms of objects from an especially famous grouping in a country house would be brought over, and the room would be recreated by the National Gallery's exhibition design team. Here's one of the gallery's spaces in the exhibition. You can see it wasn't just paintings that were brought over, but great sculptures, decorative arts, and furniture. To arrange for these shipments, initially a team of conservators and registrars went over to the UK to measure every object to be lent. Then crates were constructed according to these measurements by the British art moving companies. Then we conservators arrived in London using a London hotel as our base, and we met each of our moving vans at the shipping company on Monday morning, and we headed off to pick up the works of art at each of the country houses during the week. And then we would return with a full moving van and return on Fridays and go to the airport and travel back with the shipment back to Washington. Here's a nice view of the empty crates being offloaded from the trucks, getting opened up and ready to receive the objects to be transported. Here, this shows you how important the pre-planning was. The huge Gainsborough portrait that, as I remember, they knew that the crate would not fit upright in the British van, and that the painting had to travel at a slight diagonal, which we were not happy about, but that was the way it had to be. And here, finally, just one funny little side story. I think the men had stopped. They pulled the truck over onto to a pull-in area to get a cup of coffee at a pub or use the facilities or something. And by chance, the driver managed to get the front left tire of the truck caught in a manhole cover, and the truck started to list slightly. It was loaded from top to bottom with valuable works of art. It started to slip, sort of slant over. You can't see it here too well, but I was extremely worried. And remember, this is the pre-cell phone days. So it took us a long time to finally find somebody from a garage who came and had some long sort of steel beams that could be they created a kind of a ramp into the manhole cover, and the truck was able to drive up out of the ramp. But that was a time of great nervousness. Finally, one of our favorite courier trips was always taking paintings to Venice, to the Accademia Gallery, because we would arrive at the loading dock with our trucks and crates, the loading dock near the Venetian railroad station overlooking the Grand Canal and the island of Venice. We would be met by big barges. Small derricks would lift the crates up on slings and swing the crates out over the water into the barge, which was always very nerve-wracking. Then we would get into the barges ourselves with our agent and float down the Grand Canal and arrive at the docks in front of the Academia Museum, always watched by curious groups of onlookers. It was a wonderful way to end a career trip and also to end my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sarah, thank you so much. Everyone is so excited about what you just spoke about, and we have so many questions. And I just want to express appreciation for sharing your career, your experience with us. This was fascinating, a fascinating look behind the scenes at part of the art world that we don't often get a chance to see. So let me ask some of the questions here. Really excellent talk is shared, and a question given: how painstaking this work is. Is there a recommended limit to the amount of time, for example, 2 hours, 3 hours, that a conservator would spend per day doing it?
Oh, no, we have never been as organized as that. We do have special health advisors that advise our National Conservators Organization and specialize in giving advice about that. But no, it was up to each individual to say, I'm stiff, I just can't do anymore. There was never a set recommended amount of time, but it was very painstaking, and often, you'd be quite stiff after hunching over a painting for hours on end.
There's a question also about whether treatment of varnishes vary by museums. The questioner has been told that the French at the Louvre, for example, will not remove old varnish. Do you know if that's true?
Yes, that's, I had to leave some of those details out for lack of time, but yes, there are different schools of thought about varnish removal. And that gets back to the question of subjectivity and the whole approach to the aesthetic side of treatment of paintings. But yes, the French believe in thinning down the varnish and balancing different parts of the painting according to what they think is the best look of the painting. But that is also one of the reasons why the Mona Lisa has not been cleaned. It's getting, darker and darker, and it would be so controversial to clean it that the French at the moment, they've studied it very thoroughly and found wonderful things out about Leonardo's techniques, but they have not yet dared trying to clean it.
Thank you. A couple questions here. If Damar varnish is mixed into a painter's medium, is darkening impossible to correct?
Yes, that's true. If it's a part of the medium, you cannot change it. It creates a darkened look, and many, especially 19th century paintings, painters included Damar in their mastic and Damar in their paint medium, and yeah, it darkens very much, and you can't do anything about that.
If damage is discovered, does a painting go down in value, especially if it's revealed by a technical process to reveal previously unknown damage?
Oh, it's so accepted that old paintings have some damage. It really depends on the extent of the damage, probably. If we're talking about little tiny flake losses, a little tear here and there, no, I don't think it would be critical in the value of the painting. I think if there were large losses and a lot of reconstruction necessary, that would affect the value of a painting. I know that that Leonardo portrait of Christ that was recently sold in 2017 for the multiple millions I mentioned, it had quite a bit of damage. And I don't think it affected the value too much.
One other question here. When a painting on wood is chiseled for transfer, when does the process signal stopping before damaging the paint? So when a painting on wood
Wait,
is
could
chiseled,
you, is what, is
chiseled, or
chiseled?
maybe the term was cradled, was that, or chiseled for transfer?
Cradled.
Cradled, okay. When does
or cradled, that technique that yeah.
that backing technique, when does the process,
Yes.
when does the process signal stopping before damaging the paint?
That's a little confusing question, but the cradle doesn't usually affect the any condition of the paint, because if the painting stays in a stable and relative humidity condition, so a cradle doesn't really affect the front
Let me
of the painting.
clarify.
If yeah.
It said in the Q&A, I'm sorry to jump in, but in the Q&A it said chessled, Chessled. When a painting on wood is chessled or chesled,
I don't know that term.
Okay. Let me go on to another
I'm not
question.
sure what the writer.
And,
Okay.
and if the person that wrote that wants to correct us and, chime in again, that would be chiseled, Chisselled, chiseled.
Yeah, chiseled. If the
Okay.
yes, well, yes. Generally, if the original wood has been chiseled off the back of the painting, then a new protective support has been glued to the back of the painting to replace the missing wood. So either that cradle I mentioned or a canvas or something. So, but the chiseling process can damage the painting because the wood is chiseled off quite close to the reverse of the paint layer. So yes, the chisel can and is known to go through the back of the painting if the chiseler is not careful, if that was the question.
Okay. I have a couple more comments and questions here. When you watched the packaging of the painting, did you ever have to shout, "Stop, don't do it," or "Don't do that," and get them to change the way they were packaging it?
No, certainly not when I was at the National Gallery watching our own paintings being packed. We had a wonderful staff of art handlers who did fabulous packing jobs. At the borrowing museums, they usually were hugely professional. So I don't think that, and the painting would always have gone through an approval process before being allowed to be lent. So so the painting would be very stable before being loaned. So I don't remember having to yell "stop" during a packing process.
Thank you. Just some other comments here. This has been fascinating, detailed, and well-paced presentation. I knew very little about restoration, conservation of paintings. And yes, folks are really very pleased. I just want to thank you again for your incredible work and your insights, and for sharing your career with us. We'll have to get you back to talk about some of these courier stories, because there's it sounds like those were some big adventures. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this talk by Sarah Fisher. There is a recording that will be made available, and I want to welcome you to visit us again for upcoming lectures in the new year. And until then, thank you and bye for now.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Sarah.